Hello and a very good evening to all of you. First of all, wish you a very happy Children's Day to all of you. Here we'll discuss the important topic that is regarding GDP calculation. And in GDP calculation, there's a term called base year. So many a times you must have seen the question based on the base year of GDP. Sometimes they ask directly what is base year and which year is the base year for India's GDP, inflation, etc. So first of all, here we need to understand that what's the meaning of base year. Base year, generally we can say it is a reference year where we can compare with this particular year. Suppose the current reference year is 2011-12. It means if we want to calculate the GDP of 2018-19 with reference to this particular year, you have to see the growth. That is why the base year is important. Now there are two important things in selecting the base year. First of all, it should be a normal year. What's the meaning of normal year? Means there was no like crisis situation, so no crisis and no boom. So if a particular year experiences this, then we cannot select this particular year as a base year. The another one is the latest year. So it should be a latest year. Like before 2011-12, the base year was 2004 and 5. So you can say that if you compare the GDP growth rate 2018-19 with 2004-5, obviously you will see a sea change in the consumption pattern as well as the economy. So that's why it should be a latest year and it should be a normal year. Now you know that in 2015, Central Statistical Office, that is the nodal agency to calculate GDP. The Central Statistical Office comes under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. So CSO calculates GDP for India. Now you know in the next few months, maybe expecting in early 2020, CSO is proposes to replace the GDP base year from 2011 to a particular new base year. On that they are changing the base year with the new set of national accounts of 2017-18. So they are about to change this base year. Although we can say that why CSO is waiting, because Chief Statistician of India has been saying that we are waiting for new expenditure survey, the consumer expenditure survey, as well as annual survey of industries. So ASI, that is annual survey of industry, and we can say the consumer expenditure survey. So government is waiting for these two data and then they will change to a new GDP base year. Normally we can say changing the base year is quite a routine activity, and that is nothing new in changing the base year. So the most important thing to note here, that rebasing, that's what changing the base year means, rebasing. So that rebasing is obviously we can say a routine exercise. It is depends on the administrative decision, because consumption pattern has been changing. If you see the consumption pattern 2011-12 compare with 2018-19, so you have seen a lot of changes since 2011-12. See the growth of the smartphones 2011-12, lot few people were having. Here lot more number of people are having smartphones. So that's why changing the base year is always good. Now what we need to understand here, that regarding the base year, there is always a dispute since 2015. It's always a dispute of what? Dispute of data's accuracy or the authenticity. So we can say that these kind of data are very very important. In the last 4 years, you can say since 2015, government is struggling with the methodologies, and there are a lot of questions about the authenticity of the data. Now you know, in the recent quarter, India's GDP slipped to 5% growth in the Q1 of 2019-20. And if we compare with this data, it was 8% a few years ago. This we can say that we need certain independent studies in order to validate these kind of data that Indian economy was actually posing. Now if we see the former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramaniam's research. So if you see Arvind Subramaniam research with another great professor, Sebastian Morris of Indian Institute of Management, their research published in the public domain, and it was a great hype in the newspaper. What they were saying that GDP estimates of India that were overestimated by 0.36 percentage to 2.5 percentage points. So you can see that this is a big bracket, and according to their research, independent research, they have said that the GDP figures overestimated by this much. So you can see that there's a huge amount of scale that they are posing. Now, why there is always a distrust into the government data? What is the question against the official GDP figures that India is facing or the researchers are actually posing? Now, to understand this, we need to trace back a little bit of history. So if we go back to the year 2015, when the Central Statistical Office changed the base year. Now the CSO released a new series in 2015 and took the GDP base year to 2011-12 from the earlier 2004-2005. So it was changing. Now the rebasing thing is quite a common phenomena, and we can say 7 to 10 years every period. Every 7 to 10 years we generally change the base year, just because of changing economic structure, or we can say the prices of the commodity. That's why we have to change the base year in 7 to 10 years. Now such rebasing all the time actually led to marginal rise in the India's GDP figure. So always whenever you revise the GDP base year, you will experience that certain rise in the GDP, that is the absolute GDP account. It doesn't mean the percentage, absolute means the actual numbers of the GDP. So you must see that there's a little change, a little hike. Now here we can say that rebasing generally do not alter the any pace of economic expansion. So expansion that economy is facing, like the growth in the industrial sector, growth in the service sector, growth in other sector, that do not alter. What this thing or what the revision actually done, revision is just for changing the consumption pattern, or mainly we can say the economic structure as well as the prices. Now if you see in 2015, when we changed the base year to 2011-12 from 2004 and 5, actually the GDP contracted by 2.3%. Generally we can say that GDP growth rate, if you see, that went up from 4.8% in the old base year to the 6.2% in the new base year. So you've seen that there's a high rise in the GDP growth rate. If you see the manufacturing sector growth, it was minus 0.7%, and that rose to 5.3% with a new base year. So you can see that there are large variation in the growth rates for the same years, the two base year. So in the actual terms, GDP declined by 2.3%, but in the GDP growth terms, that has increased by certain large variation. Obviously we can say that this new series is always better because it takes certain other things also into consideration. Like if you see 2004-2005, calculator was prominent, not the smartphone, but in 2011-12 the demand for calculator went down. Now if you see the data of beauty parlors in 2004-5, that was pretty less, but in 2011-12 the beauty parlors are also considering a lot of income generation. So that's why we have to take into consideration the new and rising economic sectors. Now the question arises especially after the November 2016. So November 2016, important policy decision of demonetization. Now, the demonetization is announced in November 2016 when high valued currency, almost 86% of the currency, that is the currency notes of 500 and the rupees 1000, actually taken back by the Reserve Bank of India. If you see, for example, there is a report quoted that if you see the Ministry of Finance report on the income tax reform that provided the data on the fixed investment, especially in the private corporate sector. So we see the data of this private corporate sector based on the corporate tax returns. It shows that fixed investment, that is very important indicator of the GDP, fixed investment to GDP ratio. Like we have seen that fiscal deficit to GDP, on the same lines we can see that fixed investment to GDP ratio that actually fell from 7.5% to 2.8% just after the demonetization. So here we can say that the national accounts, if you see that actually on the nominal terms GDP growth rate went up from 11.7% to 12% in the same time period. So that actually rose the suspicion of the economist as well as the other researcher. Now similarly, if you see the research of Geeta Gopinath, currently Chief Economic Advisor of International Monetary Fund, currently Chief Economist of this IMF, that actually published that the adverse effect of demonetization on GDP growth rate. So his paper was the effect of demonetization on GDP growth rate. Now she said that the official GDP figure was 8.2% in the year 2016-17. That was the highest. So here we can say that also rose the question about the data of 8.2% that government was posing. Now what's the main problem here that government of India actually facing? So here we can say the major problem is the methodologies of calculating GDP. Now here we can say that a lot of economists are saying that these kind of data are flawed. It means there are a lot of false data presented in front of the in the public domain. First we can say that if you see the data of CSO, Central Statistical Office, if you see the data of CSO that estimated certain value addition to the private companies, is companies regarding their the financial results or annual financial results. So AFR, the annual financial results or returns, what they are doing. Now the private corporate sector accounts for, we can say, around 34% of India's GDP, that is private corporate sector. If you see that half of the corporate sector that originates their output from the manufacturing sector. So India's GDP, almost private companies, the private corporate sector are actually contributing 34% of GDP, and 50% of these private companies are taking or originates in the manufacturing sector. If you see the data of MCA, that is Ministry of Corporate Affairs, that a lot of people are saying that the data is criticized. Why? Because of the overestimation. So overestimation played an important role here that government actually introduced. Like for example, the active companies, if we see the active companies located in India, if you see the active companies in comparison to the data compared by NSSO. So active companies posed by, we can say, the Ministry of Corporate Data is saying that there are a lot of active companies. What are active companies? It means they are filing the returns as well as last 3 years they have conducted the audit as well. But an independent research agency, National Sample Survey Organization or Survey Office currently, which is named as, what NSSO found that 42% of the sample survey companies are actually not traceable and they are failed to provide certain audited accounts. It means the NSSO conducted a study and from that sample size 42% of companies were not present or were not actually active. What Ministry of Corporate Affairs data is showing. Now if you see that these are the important things that we need to understand, because if GDP at the center, it means at the union level, if this will give the faulty data, it will also affect the state level GDP. So that is actually currently happening, and state domestic products also happening, affecting by the estimation used by the central government or the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So this is also creating problem. Like another defect in the MCA data is, MCA data is having the headquarter location of the company but not the location of their production unit or the industry. That is one of the fault by the MCA data that they are actually providing in the public domain. If you see that the current base year of 2011-12 also based on national system of accounting, that is on the lines of United Nations organization, but here we can say that India has been always following the UN guidelines, but if you increase the sample size, it doesn't mean that it will give more growth or it is better. So actually calculating the sample size plays an important role. Now the question arises what we should do. Now what government should do? Government proposed the change of the base year to 2017-18, and the new base year is always a good sign. It's always a good sign because you'll get the updated figures and these data related to the current national accounting series. Obviously it's very good for the country's up to date data, as well as it will improve the quality of data, especially for the research and for the policy makers. Now here if we see the current series, there are a lot of questions. If we'll not update, this is the best time that India can incorporate certain new items in the GDP data or GDP series, and we can remove the fault that increase the controversy regarding the methodology. So the methodological problem also creating, that's why we can say that for the next 5 years there won't be any revision. So this revision must be up to the mark, and this revision will actually restore the trust of the researcher, policymaker, as well as the citizen. So this is what we want, that government should incorporate the latest amount of data. So just the main thing that I would like to suggest, that if you are calculating the data, so Ministry of Corporate Affairs should cross check that particular data that they are actually publishing in the public domain. So that's it for today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any doubt, you can ask. So we have one doubt. We are still not able to get how the new base year increased GDP growth rate. New base year actually got some, if you compare, I'll give you the comparison. If you know that 2004-2005 was the old base year, and 2012, 11 and 12 is the new base year. Now you know, if you think from yourself, you see the consumption pattern in 2004-5. Consumption of calculator is obviously more in which base year? Obviously in 2004-5, and it went down in 2011-12. If you see the smartphones, there was no smartphone in 2004-5, but there's a high demand of smartphone 2011-12. So you can see that there are a lot of things like this. You can think on your own that in 2004-5 there was less demand for fast foods or packaged item, so less demand. But here in 2011-12 there is a high demand. The high demand of, we can say, maid services of the maid. Here the demand is high in 2011-12 due to corporatization of Indian economy. So these are the examples that you can compare. That's why they increase the actual figures in the GDP, because that capture the actual data of the sectors which are doing well in the current aspect. Yeah, so the next is from Ankit Pandey. Though there are overestimation in the GDP calculation proved by many researchers, but how to defend from the government side? we need to defend from the government side. We can give that we are now capturing good amount of sector, previously that they were not included. Like suppose for example, as I said in the previous slide, or maybe this slide, so in the old series the GDP growth rate was 4.8%, and the new series suddenly it jumped to 6.2%. So you can understand that suppose the data is showing that 4%, 4.8% of GDP growth rate in the old series, but suppose in the new series India achieved 6.2% growth rate, that is approximately 1.4% increase in the GDP. How we can actually prove or substantiate this? How we are now capturing data which is currently in trend. Like for example, I'll give you the example. Now in 2011-12, you know that there was less purchase from e-commerce platforms. Now if you compare with 2017-18, you know that e-commerce platform is the best marketplace or most preferred marketplace for the consumers to buy goods. Now the services are also available. So services are also provided by this e-commerce. Like there's an example of urban clap. So there is one app or one initiative, that the urban club, that provides services also. So there was no services. So from the government side you can define that now we are capturing the good amount of data as well as the latest data. So that's why the growth is, they are showing high amount of growth. That's the simple fact behind it. I hope you got the answer. Yeah, so next is from Sonal. How many times are taken into consideration every time when the base year changes? Actually, it depends on the nature of the economy. We cannot say how many items are taken into consideration, because GDP is a full amount. If you compare with the other index, like if you see CPI, there are 200 items. If you see WPI, there are 697 items. But if you see GDP, that covers all the sectors, all the items. So that's why it is gross domestic product, and it comes with a lag of 1 year. So it takes a lot to calculate. So that's why. So I hope you got your answer, Sonal, and this is the only reason. So we don't know the item number. All the items are included in GDP. All the economic activities that are going. Yeah, you have to know only the items in CPI and WPI, because in examination they ask about CPI and WPI. That's why if you have seen that GDP deflator, we do not calculate inflation with GDP deflator, because GDP deflator comes with a lag. We need GDP data, and GDP data is a long-term data. So obviously we're not getting for a monthly data or bi-monthly data, but the data comes out as a particular year. So again we are meeting at 10:30 p.m. Just want to remind you again and again, from Monday to Saturday. This is the current economic discussion. And analysis. So current economic discussion and analysis. Now this is very helpful for the UPSC examination, because they ask regular question regarding the current economic discussion. So helpful for Indian Administrative Services examination, both for preliminary as well as the mains. And if you are from economics optional background, that is also helpful. In the Indian Economic Service examination, that is also helpful. Apart from this, RBI phase 2 is coming, so you'll get the good answer writing practice from these, and you'll get the content from these kind of discussions. And apart from this, the bank examination, that is also, you'll get the help in this, as well as the interviews. so you'll get the points in the interviews as well. So don't forget to subscribe Ecoholics, and if you have already subscribed, then thank you so much for subscribing Ecoholics. And apart from this, just want to let you know that tomorrow, 15th November 2019, we are starting a new batch of economics optional. That would be the last batch for 2020. And for the economics optional students, you can visit our website or you can contact on this number. This is the number of manager Ecoholics, so she'll handle all your doubts. And if you want to contact directly to me, you can always contact on this number. That is the WhatsApp number, my personal number. So that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Good night.